This is the invasion of New York, the second phase of the War for Independence for the colonists. I worried about an individual here, just as I looked at George Washington the First. Thomas Paine was a very influential writer in the American Revolution, and he wrote a tract called Common Sense. And I want to talk a little bit about the argument, or the main points of the argument in Common Sense. The first thing and point that he made, that's made in the Declaration of Independence too, is that, but Thomas Paine argues broadly that monarchy is inevitably a thirst for absolute power, that it's not a institution that you can trust limiting the power on. So he does make an argument, and that's a quote from his Common Sense. This is a thirst for power. He argues that trade was in fact hurt for the colonists to be in the British imperial system, actually hurt their trade, actually hurt their economic interests in the colonies. So it was better to free themselves from the British imperial system, trade system. It threatened their liberties, of course. A thirst for absolute power would, and that a complete break was both necessary and inevitable. And he argued not just that the complete break was necessary and inevitable, but that they could, in fact, govern themselves. So he spoke of their traditions of governing themselves autonomously. In the northern colonies, New England, they had the town hall recall, where they came relatively democratically. All people who were members of the church could vote. And then in the South, they had the representative assemblies. And whereas these were not perfect democratic institutions at the time, at least they were a sharing of power and a limiting of any one individual from having power, and they had served the colonies for 150 years in some cases. So Paine's argument is, we have the institutions and we have the experience of governing ourselves, so we can do it if we break completely from England and the imperial system. He also said that made an argument that the individual self-interest of a colonist was in their choosing to be patriots and to join the revolutionary cause would be for the greater public good. And so he ends his Common Sense with an Enlightenment thought, which is that people seeking their own self-interest would benefit the greater public good ultimately in the end. And that argument actually was made before him, or right at the same time actually, in 1776 by Adam Smith. But so it was a thought out there, and it was a very powerful argument, especially in the colonies. Other people that were involved in and were one way or the other are the Loyalists. I want to say a few things about Loyalists and Native Americans and slaves. The Loyalists were not as good a propagandists as the Patriots. So the Patriots they were excellent, especially in New England. And so that Patriot cause in New England really generated a lot of support. But they did have the whole continental system, the committees of correspondence that were generating support, agitating, if I can say it that way, the people to join the cause against the British Empire. Now, about 15% of the population were loyalists in the colonies broadly. Many of them were found in New York and Pennsylvania in the South. In these middle colonies, they tended to be the educated and the wealthy, tended to be educated and wealthy. So both New York and Pennsylvania are very diverse populations. New York, because of its history of first being a Dutch colony and then a British colony and then a trading port that encouraged a lot of commercial activity and brought in lots of different types of people. And then Pennsylvania, because it was from the get-go, a tolerant society in Pennsylvania built by the Quakers. and they tended to be Anglican. So that was the middle colony profile. In the South, they tended to be recent immigrants and Anglican, actually, but recent immigrants. Most of them, the majority of them, were in the South. So when we turn to the third phase of the war, I know we're only in the second, but the third phase of the war, the British aren't wrong in assuming that there are lots of loyalists down there. They're just wrong in assuming how much help they could expect from them. All right, the natives and slaves, who did they join? What side did they join? The natives in America, the Native Americans were generally speaking pro-British. The young man to the right is a Native American who joined the British military, or joined the British war effort, I should say, and became a lieutenant general in the British Army, and led mostly Native Americans as a lieutenant general, and he functioned as auxiliary, running skirmishes with his Native American troops against the colonists. And his name is Joseph Brant. So the British do advance to generalship. Excuse me. People like Joseph, or they did advance Joseph Brant anyways. There was an exception. The Iroquois tended to remain neutral, and then a couple of the tribes of the Iroquois actually joined the colonial effort, but in general the Iroquois are considered to be a neutral factor in the war, so they didn't see either the British or the colonists as people that would they could seek their advantage with. Slaves, it was a win-win if they could join one of the war efforts for the most part. I'm not going to say each and every slave who joined the war effort was freed at the end, but many of them were. Whether they joined for the British or whether they joined with the colonists, many of them received their freedom in the end. If they joined with the British, they had to make it to Canada to maintain their freedom. And so that was a win-win for former slaves and then former slaves who joined the war effort. All right, so phase two, with all of these conditions growing in the war, the British decide to abandon their phase one effort in New England to basically nip it in the bud and stop where all the patriot fervor and the fomenting of revolution was, and to head for the New York Harbor and the Hudson River. And at the New York Harbor and on the Hudson River, they thought they could divide the colonies in half, so take the Hudson River, and then they would, the South was more, there were more people on their side, so they didn't see the southern colonies and the middle colonies there as much of a problem, and they could fight the New England region after dividing them from the other colonies. So this was cut the colonies in half and fight New England, and then in that way they would defeat the patriot cause in the New England region. Remember, New England is the states that are Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut today, and then I guess New York, and New York. So two generals for the British cause. General Howe was supposed to take Long Island and then go up the Hudson River, and he would meet up the Hudson River the General Burgoyne. He does battle on Long Island with George Washington. So Howe fights a battle with George Washington. His problem is, well, we'll talk about what his problem is. General Burgoyne started in Canada, and he came down through Lake Champlain into the Hudson and down the Hudson River, or that was the plan. Now that was a much longer trip and through much thicker forest and very hard passage, and he had a large army with him, but with a lot of attendant things to do. Like they brought along the commanders brought along their wives, so they had wives with them. They had to get through a very heavy, thicketed forest. So it was a tough going, and it took a long time. So his campaign from Canada and from the St. Lawrence River down was very difficult, and he finally is the guy, as we learned in the beginning, that would lose at Saratoga, right? This divide and conquer strategy failed. Howe didn't go up the Hudson River after battling George Washington on the Battle of Long Island. So he fought with George Washington on Long Island. He even offered, actually, before that, to allow all of these colonists who had signed the Declaration of Independence, to allow them to have a pass if George Washington would surrender. So when Howe gets to Long Island and New York, he first meets with George Washington and says, you guys can surrender and there will be no problem for the signers of the Declaration of Independence, who are officially treasonous, mind you. So that was a treasonous thing. And George Washington says no, and he fights Howe on Long Island, and he loses very badly, and he takes his troops out at the last moment and escapes with his troops, but it was a very tenuous situation. It was a very harsh defeat for the colonial armies. Howe, though, instead of going up the Hudson River and conquering the Hudson River, he decides he wants to nip the revolution in the bud by capturing the revolutionaries in Philadelphia. So he took his army off to Philadelphia, and the revolutionaries, of course, quickly leave Philadelphia and went west of Philadelphia, but left the city itself. And I think they ended up in Harrisburg, if I'm not wrong, what is Harrisburg today. So Howe goes to Philadelphia instead of up the Hudson. Burgoyne is moving slowly down and finally reaches the Hudson and moves down, but he is harried all the way along by colonial militias. And so by the time he gets to Saratoga, his army is beleaguered, and he will lose the battle at Saratoga. The Continental Army then relies on a strategy of surprise. So they found out after the Battle of Long Island that facing the British on the battlefield was tough. So better strategy was to just surprise troops. So there's two battles actually that George Washington engages in where he surprises troops. One's in Trenton and one's in Princeton. And he will surprise on December 25th, on Christmas morning, Hessian troops in Trenton, New Jersey, and defeat them. And then he will move on to Princeton 1 week later. Trenton is important because the Hessian troops, you can see that the British hired on. A Hessian is a German soldier, right? And the British then had hired German soldiers to help them in this war effort. And they were out for hire, the German militaries. And they had some of the best trained soldiers in all of Europe in this period. So this was a big expense for the British. And 1 week later, they went to Princeton. The same thing. They were able to surprise the troops there. So that's how George Washington was going to win this war. By surprising. So those are two victories for George Washington, and both of them are surprise attacks, almost ambushes. Right? Finally, there's two more battles that the colonists are going to win. One is Saratoga. So in October of 1777, the colonists would defeat the British at Saratoga, which was the first picture that you saw in this presentation at the beginning of the presentation of the War for Independence. So Saratoga was a colonial victory. That's when Burgoyne finally got down onto the Hudson, and he made it to the fort at Saratoga, and then he was defeated at Saratoga. Horatio Gates was the American the colonial general who defeated him. He was the Conway Cabal. He was one of the generals that they wanted to replace George Washington with. The Second Continental Congress refused to do that, but nonetheless. Now the French were willing to strengthen their alliance with the colonists, and they loaned them money for the effort, badly needed money, and they were always at war with the British, as were the Spanish. So the Spanish also loaned the Americans some money. The French loaned the Americans some money. And the British were in world war, mostly against the French at this point. And so these things were making it very difficult for the British in the American colonies. Right? In addition, the Battle of Saratoga meant that with all this money, now the colonists had the ability to finance their war, and they were badly needed supplies, both arms and armor and just basic supplies for the troops, food and blankets for sleeping in, military uniforms. They also brought in French generals to help them with the war effort, or French, I don't think Lafayette was a general, but anyways, Lafayette was a young French aristocratic soldier, and he much admired George Washington and the Americans and the whole effort to build a republic. So he was an enlightened aristocrat in France. And the French loaned the American colonist Rochambeau, and General Rochambeau was an expert in siege warfare. And the Americans would end up laying a siege on the British at Yorktown, which is the last of their victories. They were able then also to pay their troops and supply and provide uniforms for the troops, supplies, blankets, everything, like I said. And this was a whole new, as I have here, a new leaf for the war effort. Also, they would finally loan the Navy to the Americans. So the French Navy would come up and help the Americans finally at Yorktown to defeat the British, the last effort. Just so you can see, and we all have that image of, and I'll show you an image of it in a second, of Valley Forge. That in 1777, so Saratoga is later in 1777, but the winter 77 to 78, Valley Forge, George Washington troops were holed up in Valley Forge. And they suffered from famine, lack of food, it was a very cold winter, and they didn't have blankets or any sort of supplies to keep them warm, shoes for their feet. They were very low on uniforms, and they suffered from disease. So it was a horrible winter, and many of them did die from disease. At this time, a German general came over, volunteered to help the Americans, and his name was Wilhelm von Steuben, and he was a Prussian general and a Prussian expert in organizing the military. So he helped General Washington to organize and train, especially training of men in fighting and combat situations. So von Steuben set out the pattern for many years to come for Americans to train troops, and he would help Washington at this dire moment. So French financing, the whole key to Valley Forge is French finances couldn't have come at a better time. And this is a picture done at the time, I believe, of General Washington at Valley Forge and the suffering of the troops at Valley Forge. So there you go. And we'll close that off here. And we will do the third phase in one more segment.